Okay. It's nice to have Dee with us today. Her area of work is helping with good, positive ways to deal with our dying. And she'd spoken to us a couple of years ago, and I thought, well, a lot of time's elapsed, and it will be very nice indeed to hear a bit more. Personally, I need an awful lot of knowledge I haven't got, so I guess I'm being a bit selfish. I knew that was something I really wanted to hear more about. So we've asked her back. And apologies again for the wait, Dee. Thank you.
No, that's absolutely fine. I've got to have my own technical stuff this morning. So one of the joys of chatting on Zoom is being able to read what I'm saying. But of course, when I'm reading what I'm saying, I can't see any of you. So I'll flip back and forth periodically. So I'm aiming to talk for about 20 minutes or so. And then I'm very happy to answer any questions that you might have afterwards. And yes, so shall I get started then? Are you all sitting comfortably and got your cups of tea? So my mum would often say that I've always been a very happy talker, a chatterbox, if you'd like. But I would say that until life events took me in this direction, I would never have imagined I would be offering talks entitled Everything You Need to Know About Death and Dying, but were afraid to ask. However, life has a strange way of taking you on a journey, and before you know it, here we are. So I'd like to thank Patsy for inviting me to come and talk with you all again. I didn't need my arm twisting much, did I, Patsy? Because A, I thoroughly enjoyed myself last time, which I can't believe is 2 years ago. And B, I'm really happy to talk, especially about this subject. So thank you all for listening. As I say, I've planned a chat of around 20, possibly 25 minutes, and then I'll open it to you all for any questions. So as those of you who will know who heard my first talk, my name is Dee Ryding, and I'm the owner and founder of Divine Ceremony Funeral Directors based at the Sanctuary on Zetland Road. And I've been involved in funeral land for around 16 years now, firstly as a humanist celebrant, and I was National Celebrant of the Year in 2014 for the Good Funeral Guide. And since 2014, I've been working as a funeral director and undertaker alongside that celebrant work. So at Divine Ceremony, we cater for all faiths and none and care for our families, curating funerals from the traditional to the very alternative. And in 2015, I was nominated as Most Promising Funeral Director, again with the Good Funeral Guide, and was named as one of Bristol's Changemakers by Bristol City Council. And so I was nominated by the community for my work in funeral care. And I say all this really by way of introduction, but also to show how broad my background has been and how lucky I've been to have enjoyed such a variety and a very varied and diverse career so far. So in the last 16 years, I would say that I have led something in the region of over 2,500 ceremonies. And broadly speaking, those ceremonies split into two camps, the planned and the not planned. And there's absolutely no judgment here. I'd like to stress that planned or not planned does not have a bearing on how good the funeral or the ceremony was, even if we ignore the subjectivity of the word good. Rather, for me, the planned or unplanned element affected those left behind much more. And what we know is that each of us will be required to manage around 3 funerals in our lifetimes. And most of us will arrive at each funeral largely unprepared, spiritually, emotionally, and in some cases financially. And yet the difference that I see as a funeral director when family come in and say, oh, mum left her wishes, or even those families that had come in previously and planned the funeral before their loved one died, the difference is palpable. It's often a much calmer, smoother experience. And whilst I can't change the journey, we can help smooth the process, and planning can be a really important part of that. And that's really the nub of what I want to talk to you about today. So what is funeral planning? How do we write one? And what's the difference between a funeral plan and planning for our funeral? And I'm very happy to answer any questions that come up. And I know from Patsy that this is an area that people do have questions, but we often don't know how to go about asking those questions. So I'll do my very best to answer any questions you do have today. And if I don't know an answer, I'll endeavour to find out that answer for you. So here we go. Death, dying, funerals and planning, a massive subject in little over 20 minutes. I'm going to spend a bit of time now talking about funeral plans, the ones that you buy, and my opinion on them for what it's worth. I'd like to be clear here that I'm not affiliated to any plan provider. I don't benefit from any plan providers at all. In fact, I don't think I've sold a single plan in the 16 years that I've been in the industry. What I'm going to say is based on my opinion solely, based on the years that I've been supporting people to arrange and plan for funerals. So many of us will reach a certain stage of life and decide that we want to get things sorted, and some people will take out a funeral plan, which will usually require either a full-on upfront payment or a little bit to pay each month. And there we are, the job's done. But really, is that the best way to go? It could be, in many cases, 20, 30 years before the plan is required. And can you really be sure that your wishes will remain the same for that whole time, however flexible the plan is? Are you absolutely sure that you're paying for the things that you need, not for extras that are sometimes hidden within a funeral plan package, things that you don't really want? So it can be hard to decipher those elements if you're taking out a funeral package. In more recent times, a number of those providers have actually gone bust, leaving many, many thousands of families without any provision when the time comes, despite paying in for some years to a plan. So I've really come to the conclusion that you can keep your own money, open an additional ISA or savings account and label it funeral pot. It's there when you need it. Your families or executors can always draw on this in the event of your death to pay your funeral costs, even if probate has frozen your finances. And this is really something to think about, not least because many funeral plans have a cost up front to start the plan itself. And this could actually be saved by simply keeping that yourself. So despite my concerns about funeral plans, I am nonetheless an absolute advocate for funeral and end-of-life planning itself. A recent survey of over 2,000 adults by the Dying Matters Coalition revealed that only a third of us have written a will. I'm in that third, and I'm a funeral director, so actually this talk is also for me. And just 21% of individuals have discussed their wishes with their partner upon their death. And these aren't really unusual figures, certainly not from my experience. Most of us have not had the conversation. Most of us would have very little idea what choices to make in the event of their partner dying. So what I'm really talking about here are your last wishes, what you want to happen when you are dying and after you've died, where you would like to be, who even would you like to see you after you've died? Do you want a funeral ceremony? What music would you choose? All those wishes, alongside the more practical choices as to where your funeral would be held, are important. And more important, would you want to be buried and cremated? I've noticed a big increase, particularly since COVID, in the phrase, I don't want a funeral, I'll have a direct cremation and be no fuss to anyone. But I also need to say that I see the fallout of this choice for those people that are left behind after the death of someone close. And this can cause real upset, much worse than the fuss you were trying to avoid in the first place. On the other hand, some people really want to make a fuss. Some people need to. So it's a good reason to have a think about what you want. And importantly, if you can, to either discuss it with your family and close friends, or at least write it down and put it somewhere, perhaps with your will. Then you can get on with your life. But importantly, those wishes will remain for those that need them. I think it's probably worth making a nod here to something called an advance decision to refuse treatment, which is formally known as an advance directive. And this can be made while we have mental capacity. It lets you choose and explain which medical treatments you don't want doctors to give you if a time comes when you lack capacity and cannot make the decision to communicate your wishes. Another good reason to talk with family or friends to help them to know what to do in your best interest when the time comes. Ultimately, though, this all has to do with choice. What choices you make for your funeral will be so helpful to your family and friends when they're left to manage it. And what do we do if our family and friends don't want to have the conversation, or it feels too difficult to have that conversation with people close to you? And it is really difficult, I know that. And that's where people like myself and my colleagues and other funeral directors or people who have knowledge can come in and help. We can be a good initial sounding board, prepare the way for those talks with family and friends. Or we can simply help to prepare the plan and leave you with that plan. And as I said earlier, pop it with your will and then just get on with the rest of your life. In 2014, alongside a really good friend, Claire Turnham, I set up the Home Funeral Network, which is now largely a Facebook page that kind of really manages itself. We set it up to support professionals and families to care for their loved ones at home after they had died. You see, I'd begun to see that the care of someone at home is often such a profound personal experience for everyone involved. And the idea that immediately after someone has died, they would be removed from their home by the funeral director seemed such a harsh change, and one that really negated the true importance of that time just after someone has died. But when you're in that process, it's really hard to know what's possible, what's achievable, even what's permissible. But I know that by keeping their person at home, a family or a group of friends are able to begin the emotional process of coming to terms with what's happened. And I've supported many families to do this and can confirm that in every case, it's been such a very healing experience, often with moments of real joy as they began to recall times with their friend or family in much happier times alongside other people who knew and loved them in their own home. Sometimes people begin the process of arranging the funeral during this time. Close friends and family might stop by to see the person who's died within hours of them dying in their own home. And there are, of course, those who truly appreciate the time to be able to follow a spiritual path at this time. So I've supported a lot of Buddhists where their Buddhist practice of not touching the body of the person who's died for 3 days after death in order to allow for the soul to find its new home for reincarnation is a really important part of their faith. And we are all such individuals, aren't we? We've all led our own unique lives. And I feel really honoured to be able to offer this continuation in death, tailoring the approach to the needs of the person who's died, and importantly, those who are left behind. This service, the home funeral service, is not for everyone, but it is helpful for people to know what they are allowed to do. And it's certainly possible for people to care for each other in the days after a death at home. I think it's really important that we have these conversations beforehand, because we might not feel able to navigate such new and potentially challenging terrain after someone's died. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we go about this planning process. And broadly speaking, there are 3 elements that are key here. Firstly, there is our own individual process of dying. And I've talked about the possibility of setting up an advanced decision to refuse treatment if that works for you. And this can sit well alongside a power of attorney document. All of these elements are things that you can put into place to ensure that your wishes are looked after and are followed, and that those who are trying to follow them have the backup plans to be able to do so. So secondly, the planning of the funeral. And this is really the logistics, if you like, the important event planning that we do. And thirdly, the third element is the ceremony itself, the content. I should also say that I have supported many families to approach a funeral via much more DIY route. And this is indeed possible. You don't have to instruct a funeral director. I do think it takes a certain person or family to do this, and I always caveat this option with the truth. You may have to suspend your own grief during the process, and it can be much harder than we imagine to hold that funeral space, so to speak. But it can be done, and for the right reasons, I am very happy to support families if they wish to go down this route. However, most of us will find that we do need a little bit more support during this time, and an undertaker or funeral director is probably best placed to do so. But how do we choose our undertaker or funeral director? And there's another tricky statistic here. 97% of us will go with the first funeral director we speak to. It's often just simply too difficult for many people to imagine having that conversation again. And I totally understand that. But how do we know that those people align with our values? Can they offer us what we need? Are they flexible enough to provide a person-centered approach that isn't just another corporate package? In my own case, my granddad died on the day of my grandmother's funeral. And as a family, we found ourselves planning 2 funerals back to back. Sadly, neither of those funerals lit a candle to the people my grandparents were, or the great lives that they had lived, or even marked the 64 years that they had been together. Neither experience did very much to support or hold our grief or acknowledge their legacy, which was a terrible shame, but really at the time, we just didn't know any better. And to add insult to injury, the costs were astronomical. It was as I got into what I now feel to be the largely irrelevant second limousine of the second funeral for my granddad, that I turned to my husband and I said, someone has to do better than this. And he said, well, you know what they say. So 16 years later, I find that I am talking to you all, and I'm really glad to do so. How to plan for the logistics so you don't end up with limousines that you don't really want or need. Here at Divine Ceremony, we've decided it would be helpful to have a document. This isn't specific to us. And in fact, I'm very happy to send this document out to you, and irrelevant of how you choose to arrange your funeral or who you choose to arrange it with, I'm hoping that this document will be a helpful guide to a conversation either with yourselves, or it's something that you can read alone initially, to buy yourself some time, so to speak, so you can get your own thoughts in order before you begin to talk to other people. We've created this last wishes document, and I'd be very happy to send this on to anyone if you would like a copy. Please let me know either through Patsy, and I can send it on to you. And this document will really help navigate all the logistical choices that need to be made, from the more personal, where would I like to be when I die? Who do I want to see me after I've died? Even how would I like to actually arrive at my funeral? And moving on to the content, it will include things like, what music would I like at my ceremony? Who would I like to speak? Or even, dare I say it, if it's not too rude a question, how Quaker do I want my funeral to be? I know how much easier the process is for a family if their loved one has had these conversations and made them known to people who matter. Families need and want to be able to make informed decisions and choices. And we can all see, I think, that the funeral industry itself is changing. Some of the changes are happening quite fast, others not quite fast enough for my liking. And families now may want individual services that truly reflect the life of the person they've died. Not everyone wants the black shiny cars or the men in black suits, but importantly, people do by and large want to be a part of the process and make those choices. I mentioned direct cremations. I think they're now very much on the agenda. Westerly Crematorium offers a direct cremation service for £490, which is significantly less than the £1,095 that they charge for a single slot in their creme. And this, I think, is an absolute game changer, because it means that splitting the ceremony from the crematorium or the burial is really possible, and I believe will become much more normalised. Ceremonies can take place almost anywhere that feels appropriate to the deceased and their families. And in fact, Quakers, you've been ahead of this curve for quite a while now, having your funeral meetings and then possibly separate burials or cremations. Even awake when I'm awake is a thing now, thanks to Grace and Perry. And over the last few years, we have curated ceremonies with the coffins in place at natural burial sites, church halls, people's gardens, even on allotments, and on one occasion, a public house. Each event was specific to the person who had died, and importantly, very appropriate for them. Funerals are thankfully also becoming greener now, and we need them to. We must begin to think about how our funeral will impact the planet and leave as little trace as perhaps we would have liked to have lived. Bespoke and green doesn't have to be expensive and can be a very cost-effective way to plan and finance your funeral. You don't even need to have a coffin. You can have a shroud if you wish. And they're so respectful and a wonderful option, in my opinion. And there are other options on the horizon: human composting, water cremations. We really must begin to lobby for our gas cremators to be changed to renewable electric machines. We should really forget shipping granite from China for headstones. And ultimately, all of this takes such a lot of thought, doesn't it? A lot of time to digest and conversations with the right people to ensure that those people close to you will make informed choices about how to say goodbye to you when the time comes. But I also know it means that we all will stay much more in command of our lives, right to the end and beyond. And I think really that's what we all want. I certainly know that I do. So I'm going to pause for now, and I accept there's been quite a lot of information packed in there. But if anybody's got any questions or would like to ask anything, please do so.
So, thanks. There's a lot of information there. Would it be possible to send the last wishes document to me via Thankfully meeting? Yeah.
Yes, I will do. Perhaps Patsy can let me know how to do that, and I might send, maybe I send the document out to Patsy initially, and she
Yeah,
can
I
figure
can.
it out.
Yeah.
Cheers.
I've written Rose's name now. Anybody, and then we'll ask if you just let me know that you would like. Or actually, I could send it out to everyone here. I would think everyone would probably. Right, Judy, you've got your hand up. You're still muted.
I wonder if it's possible to give a clear steer on which method is the most environmentally friendly, because this is my biggest concern, and I've never been able to quite find the answer.
It's a really difficult one, Judy, because I think there's a number of factors here. On the face of it, natural burial with a natural coffin, or actually preferably shroud, would be the best option. But then we have to ask ourselves, where would we do that? So if, for example, that natural burial site is an hour's drive away and 100 people get in their car and drive to that natural burial site, then is that a greener option than a cremation with a cardboard coffin in a local crematorium? Or having a ceremony somewhere local, like your local meeting house, and then perhaps just close family that attend your cremation or your burial. That for me is probably the better option, and I think it actually works very well for families, because having that private moment feels really important. And you will know by that point who is important to be there. So it's a tough choice to make, but I think also after COVID, we're much more used to people putting parameters around funerals. So I think that is a very good option. I certainly think, I have never sold MDF coffins, and it was a choice I made right from the beginning. You know, they're solvent based, they're mixed with formaldehyde, the plastic handles they're absolutely horrendous to either cremate or to burn. And there are now some really, when I first started, the cardboard coffins were, I just, you know, and I wasn't quite fingers crossed with them, but I you know, they looked a bit flat pack for my liking. Whereas the company that I work with, who are Gloucester based, so a nice local company, they're wonderful and they look like a traditional coffin. They use, you can either have a very straight cardboard or you can have one that's printed. They use a very low ink print. They look fabulous and they've got proper wood handles. Now, they are a very good alternative to MDF. They, from afar, I don't think you could tell the difference. And you can choose them knowing that you're having a much better impact on the environment. The best coffin for the greenest funeral, though, is actually willow, because it's a very natural product. It's grown much more locally to us, so in Somerset. And again, I've got no affiliations with any of these companies. They're just companies that I've sought out. And over the years, really, I like the Musgrove Willow Company for a number of reasons. One, they've been growing their willow there in Western Zoyland for decades, for generations. If you choose an unbarked willow coffin, that's a willow that's had very little treatment to it, you can be safe in the knowledge that it will actually be a very, very, very well suited to an environmental choice. It's really good for cremation. It's better than cardboard for cremation, actually. And within natural burial, it works really well. Shrouds are much, the interesting thing was, since I last spoke to you, which was 2021, for the first time ever in April this year, I actually curated more burials with shrouds than I did with coffins, which was such a massive leap forward. And I really wouldn't have expected that that would have happened in such a short space of time. But I was delighted with that because it's a much more cost-effective option. A shroud can cost, you know, £295, whereas you're looking at, you know, at least £800 or between £600 and £900 for a willow coffin, and about £400 to £600 for a cardboard. So, you know, a shroud can be a very good cost-effective option. Even though they are actually legal for cremation, we still don't have very forward-thinking crematoria in Bristol. So they aren't, even despite my constant lobbying, they still won't allow me to cremate with a shroud, despite the fact that they've been approved by all the cremation bodies and people involved, and is absolutely fine for cremation, but we can't do that as yet. But that will not be long coming. So also electric hearse, or at least a hearse that isn't diesel. But it is also the transport of the people getting there. That's also really worth thinking about, which I've touched on before. There are other things that are worth thinking about. Do you need to be printing a lot of orders of service? How important is that for you? I know that they can be a wonderful way of something to put in for the social history of a family. They're a wonderful thing to keep hold of, and I know people do. But I think we need to ask ourselves, where are we printing them? Are they being printed locally? What paper are they being printed on, and what ink are they using? And I use a local printers who use very low oil ink, and they're delivered to us by bike. And I feel for me, it's like everything else, isn't it? It's offsetting. It's about just managing your risk. And the same goes for flowers. I mean, I'm not a massive flower pusher. I know that flowers are really important to some people, but there are certain times of the year where we've all got a lot of flowers in our garden. And I can't think of a better way of adorning someone's shroud or their casket than by every person who arrives bringing a single stem and decorating the coffin themselves. And that's certainly something that we advocate quite a lot here. And then there are a lot of local growers who are very happy, and florists who work only with locally grown flowers, and that can be really useful. because flying in, it's not just the flying element of a lot of our floristry, it's also the water that's used to grow the flowers. And when I see the flowers that have been stuck in water with the dye in it, it just makes me shudder, because I just feel it's so unnecessary. So I think all of this really does point to this constant underlying thing, which is it's much better to be thinking about this, because it's really hard, it's onerous to be thinking about the planet when you're also grieving a close relative who's died. You know, it's really hard to make different choices when you're feeling at sea. Much easier to make those what might seem at times radical choices if you know that the person who died had made them with you. So I think that's what I would say about green funerals. I mean, I don't subscribe to headstones unless you're using natural stone. You know, most natural burial grounds, you have a GPS or a wooden plaque that deteriorates over time. The GPS would denote where you are, so future relatives would be able to come along and would stand in the spot where you are and know that I'm standing where they lay. But actually, the point of natural burial for me is that we don't alter the landscape in any way. And I think, you know, those sorts of conversations as communities are going to become much more important as we move forward. We need to be having conversations about what we want our future deathscapes to look like, because they can't continue to look like granite landscapes. Or, you know, what do we do with ashes? Ashes are a real problem. Ashes, in the next few years, I would predict we will be talking about the problem with ashes in a much clearer way, because ashes are quite toxic. If you put ashes around a rose bush, it will die. You know, so how do we mitigate that? And yet for years, one of the things I was completely amazed at when I first started working in this field, when I saw the ashes in the remembrance gardens and realized that the gardens were actually dead and they replanted them every year because ashes are toxic. You know, so how do we deal with that? And I think we just need, as communities, both on a personal level, but also on a community level, to be brave and have those conversations, really.
Thanks very much, Dee. I think Marianne had a question next. Okay.
Just on the basis of that, why are ashes toxic? Because, you know, in other, you know, you can get sort of chicken bone meal to put round things to enhance growth. So why are ashes, human ashes, toxic?
I think it's a number of factors. One, chickens don't tend to have a lot of fillings. So the mercury level, I mean, cremation is responsible for something like 19% of our mercury emissions every year. I mean, we just don't know about this. We don't talk about it. And you know, chemotherapy treatments, you know, what's held within our bones is not always a nurturing factor.
Right.
So, you know, honestly, I must get friends of mine send me, I'm sure you've all seen it, it's the image of the person in a sort of fetal position within a sack underneath a tree. And I get this sent to me regularly by people saying, oh, look at this wonderful idea, you could nurture a tree. But the reality is so beyond that. We need to, you know, our bodies need to become nutrients in order to be able to nurture something else. And when we have just died, we just aren't that. We are not a nutrient. We are really a byproduct of our life and the way we have chosen to dispose of our bodies. And I'm sorry that probably sounds quite harsh, but that is the reality of it.
So how do these woodland burials, how do they work? Because I thought they kind of specifically were buried in order to, you know, sustain a tree.
Well, I think it's interesting that you know, when you drill down, I thought that too initially when I first got into it. I thought, oh, I really want a woodland burial, but actually a wooden burial where you are buried within the woodland is one thing, but a woodland burial where the woodland is created over you, not a great thing. And actually, if you were to ask questions of those woodland burial grounds who operate in that manner and ask them, what is your turnover of trees? You'd be surprised at how many trees they replant every year. But again, we're not really asking those questions, really.
Fascinating.
It is, isn't it? I mean, I'm just really quite amazed by it, because there's lots of things that I just held to be truths. And actually, they're not really, they're just the way we've done them for a long time. And the fact that we've had these funeral practices for so long, and the complicity of us not talking about what we want has allowed these kind of untruths to perpetuate, really. And I do think that the ashes problem will become something that we will start to talk about much more in the near future, because it is an issue. You know, there is a company up in Nottingham. I went to visit them recently, and they are at the forefront of creating this soil called RTN soil that you can buy, and you mix it with human ashes, and it neutralizes a lot of the inherent problems that cause the plant deaths or aren't great when it goes into the ground, which is a fantastic move forward. So we are moving forward with this, but we're not at the stage yet where we're actually openly talking about this socially, and I think we really need to start doing that.
Okay, Kate. Oh, you're still muted.
Yeah, I take what you said about willow caskets. I chose for my husband a water hyacinth, and I know there's banana as well. Are they nearly as equally, or is the problem that they're being imported? I like the idea of water hyacinths because I know it's almost a plague in some lakes in Africa.
Yes. And again, I mean, it's about balance, isn't it? I think it's worth so yes, we have got the issue that they are imported. If they're imported in a Russian doll style, as in you've got they're imported where they're imported one in the other, in that way, then it's perhaps not such a problem. It's when a lot of them are imported where they're wrapped in plastic, you know, and so it's not just, so yes, there's the benefit of removing the scourge from African waterlands, great, but you know, then there's the issue of the importing. I suppose I'm constantly on this balance between feeling that we're all individuals and we all come at this in a different way. For some people, willow is just an absolute, they don't want it. They don't like the look of them. They remind them of laundry baskets. I've heard people say that, and it just wouldn't suit them. And the water hyacinth might speak to them in a different way. I just think it's worth us being aware of why we're making those choices. In the same way that, you know, if I'm in the supermarket and my recipe is requesting green beans, but actually I'm looking down and I'm seeing Peru, do I buy them that day? And I have to, you know, so I think it's just about being conscious of those choices that we're making, and understanding that moving forward, we probably really do now need to be thinking of things in a much more local way. And if willow isn't for you, then there are other options. And there is a company called eCoffins. They do a lot of this. They do seagrass, bamboo, water hyacinth. Now, I know that with eCoffins, they are very keen on how those coffins are transported. So they're not flown, for example. They travel, and it takes longer, but they aren't flown. They're transported like in Russian doll style, so they're not individually wrapped. So I think there are mitigations in those ways, but it's just definitely worth asking the question. Your funeral director may not know the answer, because I think there's a lot of la-ing that's going on, but it's definitely worth just thinking about.
I just wanted to add about willow coffins, because I had a willow coffin for my husband, and it was made partly by my daughter, who is a basket maker. But the problem there was getting it done in time, because it takes quite a long time to make, unless you're in business just for that, you know, how many coffins can you afford to have lined up just in case, because you don't know when people are going to die, and then when they do, you've got a big rush on. And she was hoping to make it all herself, but she didn't have time. So a kind of more senior, sort of somebody who was more practiced in making coffins, did most of it, but she made the lid. And it was really very beautiful. But I can kind of see that, you know, if you just sort of tick a box saying, yes, I'd like a willow coffin, you know, you might be saying, well, you know, you have to wait 6 months. So just tell that person not to die just yet.
No,
But,
Murray, the average lead-in time for a willow coffin locally is a week.
right. Okay.
And the beauty is with Musgrove that you can go there and weave it with them. And that's a free option. You don't
Wow.
pay anything extra for that, but you can go there. And many of my families have done that. And actually, I know, again, it's that being part of the process. Well, by the time the coffin is brought into the room, they made it, you know, they were part of that process. And that, again, makes a really big difference. So, you know, a week, and actually usual lead-in times for funerals, I think feels about right, a week to 2 weeks, you know, and it's very doable to get a willow coffin in that time. I mean, certainly if I tried to make a willow coffin, Marion, we'd be here for the rest of my life. I mean, I'm always in awe of the skill that it takes, but these are very skilled craftsmen who've been doing it for a very long time.
Thank you. Okay, you got your hand up now. I think Ross put her hand up just now as well, but I'm not sure. Okay, she's going to wait.
I did, but I think you partly answered it. You talked about the RTM soil. I
Yes.
kind of think, have you got any other ideas of disposing ashes that are less harmful to the environment?
In small amounts, I would say. You know, and I mean, I'm just as guilty with going back to my grandparents' funerals. They were both cremated. I didn't know any different at that point. We lifted up a patch of turf, and we had I mean, how we dealt with their awful funerals was theirs was the first funeral I wrote. And I wrote the funeral that we didn't have, and we performed it around the big tree in their garden. And I poured the ashes under the tree. Both of them went under that tree. I mean, it was a tree that they'd been in that house all their married life. It was a tree they had planted. And, you know, I don't know, obviously that was a long time ago. I don't know if the tree is still there, but certainly putting ashes around the ring of something, I think, however, so I do have a client of mine at the moment whose wife died a couple of years ago. And what he asked me to do was to split his wife's ashes into a number of small scatter tubes. And he has been walking the coastal path since his wife died in regular intervals. And he takes a bit of his wife everywhere he goes, and he straps it to the back of his rucksack, and he does a bit of the coastal path. And for him, that was his response to his grieving process. And it was also a way for him to keep his wife with him. And I know it's been an incredibly cathartic experience for him. And that is a way of dispersing in smaller amounts so that you are not, it's the huge scatter tubes that go under a brand new rose bush and people are surprised that it dies. That's the problem. Or the person who's buried in an MDF coffin, and then a tree is planted directly on the top, and the tree doesn't survive 18 months, and we're surprised. You know, trees are like us. They need nurture. They need conditions. They need compost. You know, we're no compost whatsoever in an MDF coffin, and we're not likely to become compost for some time. So how does that tree find its way? So the thing with the RTN soil that's quite interesting is you can buy it from the company. You have to use it quite quickly because it's an anaerobic process. So the soil is very anaerobic, and you mix it with the ashes, and then it goes into the soil, and the anaerobic, here I am not a scientist, but the anaerobic side of it does its job and neutralizes those more difficult elements of human ash. If you leave it on the side and don't do mum for a couple of years, or you suddenly find that the RTN soil is under the stairs like granddad is, then, you know, that's not going to do you any good at all. So it's important to time that if you use it.
Thank you. Kate, do you want?
Yeah, yeah, the other thing I wanted to ask about, you mentioned having an ISA for a funeral pot, and I've been, wondering about that, because I know from my own experience that you can't always get the money that somebody's left quickly, and so yeah, how do I ensure that my children can get it, and what sort of amount should I put aside? With inflation, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I could ask a funeral director to get a rough idea. I know some of the figures he quoted are ridiculous, but what would you recommend?
So I would say you can label, I've got a number of savings accounts with my bank, and some of them are labeled, like holiday fund or whatever, or tax, which is my favorite. So you can label it funeral pot. Now, the point at which you've died, your family need to issue the bank with an invoice which is on headed paper, and the bank will release any funds that you require that are connected to your funeral, irrelevant of whether your account has been frozen due to probate. So that's absolutely, I mean, that happens all the time. It is a misnomer that they wouldn't be able to get hold of the finances to pay for the funeral. It's possible. You just need a headed thing from a funeral director, and that includes the reception as well. And I tested that theory myself a couple of years ago with my mother-in-law, and it worked a treat. So, and it just means that for me, it just means that you keep much more control of your own finances. In terms of how much you put in that pot, well, in some ways, I mean, goodness me, I am staggered by the increase in third-party costs that have happened in the last 3 years. I mean, burials in some burial grounds in Bristol have gone from £2,500 just for your plot, to include the interment fee, to £3,670 in 1 year's increase. That's a huge amount of money. So I think it's fair to say that funerals will only increase. That's a truism. So I think it's worth, but the rule of thumb that I used to work on a rule of thumb that 3,000 to 4,000 would buy you a decent cremation, and 5,000 to 6,000 would buy you a decent burial. I think I'm probably, you're probably up a bit there. You're probably now 4 to 5.5 for a cremation. And I mean, wherever you are for a burial, you really need to look into where you would like to be buried and have a look at their costings.
Well, I know the meeting house burial ground's free,
which is wonderful. And so, and I have to say, it's just, are you talking about the Lower Hazel one?
No, we have one at our meeting house at Frenchay.
Ah, yes, the Frenchay one. So I've never been to the Frenchay one, but I have experience of the Lower Hazel one, which is lovely. And yes, and that's of course the real bonus for you as Quakers. You can be budgeting in a different way. But I think it's worth looking at your coffins, and maybe just imagining that you might want to top that up by 10% every year, because that seems to be how it goes.
Thank you.
Oh, Barney, I've got your hand up.
I'm going back to the gruesome subject of the body in the bedroom. It's probably not wearing the right clothes, and it's probably relieved itself before or after death. Is this where the family who wants to keep the person at home needs a bit of help?
Yes, so what I'm hearing, that's a really good question, actually. Practically, how do we do that? And of course, let me tell you, I am not progressive, or I'm not doing anything, I'm not suggesting anything new. This is exactly how we lived for a very long time. People who died in our communities died within our communities, and we cared for them, and it was very normal. So there's nothing horrendous that's actually going to happen, other than, as you say, most of us might have a little wee or something like that. What I'm hearing is that once we have accessed home palliative and community end-of-life services, they are really, really good. And in many cases, the point at which somebody dies at home, the palliative team will come after death to verify the fact that the person has died. And at that point, they will help lay the person out. And that will mean cleaning them up, getting them ready for the next stage. If that hasn't happened, and some families actually don't want that to happen, and they would like me to come in, for example, then as part of the home funeral network, then I would come in and I would help care for the person, very non-invasive, but very care for the person, sometimes with essential oils, if that's what the family would like, and really prepare the person for remaining at home for, say, 24, 48, 36 hours. I work with a product called, I think it's called Thermarest or Therma something. And it's like, it's a flat product that I put into water and it puffs up, and I pop 4 of those in the freezer, or put 8 of them in the freezer to start with. And I use 4 to keep the core of the person's body cool for 8 hours, and I swap them over. And it's keeping the body cool at home that's really important. Obviously, if it's the depths of winter and we've got the heating on and they're wearing all their favourite blankets, which they may well have wanted whilst they were alive, they won't be needing those once they've died. And so I'd be suggesting to remove all blankets, replaced with a simple cotton sheet, making sure that the heating's turned off in that room. And it's perfectly doable to keep somebody home in that way. And actually, I know it was interesting because I am working with a family at the moment where the lady died at home, and they'd spoken to me in the days before she died, wanting to know what the process would be. And I said, look, I don't want you to feel when the doctor comes to verify your mum's death that you have to call me immediately. Call me when you're ready. If you want some reassurance, call me, but take it at your pace, because how you feel now may not be how you feel when the time comes. And sure enough, when mum died at 7 o'clock that evening, her husband said to me, Dee, it was everything that you said it would be. There was such a peace that descended. And the palliative team came in, they prepared her body. They didn't have any of these sheets, actually, because they'd only phoned me that morning. And I'd said to them, have you got any ice packs? They had some ice packs. They put those in a pillowcase, and they kept her core body cool. And I went over the following afternoon and brought her into care. And the husband said to me, I feel that something happened for us. You know, it was a profound experience, being alongside her when she died and experiencing a kind of almost, for him, it was almost a spiritual process of seeing her body change in that 12 hours, going from being his wife to being the ship in which she'd sailed, so to speak, was for him a really profound experience. And as I say, it won't be for everyone, but I think we just need to know that this is possible, because it might be for you.
I can just mention, to follow on Barney's question, our next door neighbour wanted her father to stay at home for quite some days, and her funeral director got some sort of cooling machine.
Yes.
That more than just freezing packs, it was actually a machine, and he was there for a week, I think, and it was fine.
Yep, and that's called a Fleximort machine. Absolutely fantastic, and they are certainly available. And I think, you know, by and large, 24 to 36 hours feels right for most people. But again, we're all different. And I do see the difference in people where they feel in control of the process. And there are lots of different reasons why we might want to keep somebody at home. Not least because someone may have cared for someone at home for some years, you know. So to then suddenly hand over everything to people you've never met before might feel a completely alien concept to you. But unfortunately, we often feel very disenfranchised, disempowered at the point at which someone dies. We maybe don't feel our strong selves. We may be tired after the days of caring for somebody at the end of their life. It's really not an easy process looking after somebody who's dying at home. And so we might find ourselves in our most vulnerable state. And at that point, without having had these conversations or understanding what's actually possible, we might not feel able to ask. And I think that's a shame, really, because I think for lots of people, I know that it can be a very beneficial process.
Very good. Mary, was your...
Me, or was it Mary first?
Well, I mentioned Mary, but she's...
Yes.
Mary, can you hear me? You're muted.
Dee, you mentioned the palliative team that comes in. Who are they?
So hopefully, if you have reached an end of life stage, you will be placed under your district team. So this might be the palliative team from St. Peter's. It might be a team from Marie Curie that your family have got on board. It might be a combination of the district nurse team, palliative district nurse team in your local community, alongside St. Peter's and possibly Marie Curie. But and I can't say that it's always easy to access this team. It can sometimes take a little bit of pushing. But once you are there, I hear wonderful reports of teams that really look after people when they're dying at home. I've heard the opposite as well. I've heard people that struggled to access. But those that have been able to access certainly have found that they might come in. Sometimes they're there just to offer families some respite. They may do night sitting for a family so that they don't have to, they're not up all day and then sitting up all night with their loved one. They might be there to help wash and dress if someone's become completely immobile. They might be there to help support with pain management within the home, or to really offer encouragement and support. And if somebody's living on their own, it may be that they're there to help the person remain in their own home for as long as possible. And you'd certainly access those through a blend of GP support or direct with St. Peter's or the Marie Curie charity.
Thank you.
All right, Maria?
When my husband died, we I think we had the woodland I don't know what they're called. We're woodland burial team. Do you work with other funeral directors? Or
do you mean the Woodlands team in Thornbury?
Yes, I do.
Yes. So yeah, they're an interesting space. So I have done, I mean, this year I must have conducted 5 or 6 funerals at the Woodlands site as an independent funeral director, but with a burial on their land. That works. That works very well. Obviously, I can't deny that they would much prefer if they were doing the whole shebang.
Yeah.
But in many cases, the family have known me or may have planned the funeral with me. So they aren't, and I think one of the great benefits for me in having been a celebrant for so many years is that I stood in front of almost every funeral director's hearse over that time. So they knew me, which meant 2 things. One, that they didn't see me as much of a threat initially. And maybe I'm not much of a threat at all because I'm doing things in a different way. But also they were quite happy to support me in my endeavours, and Woodlands have been no different really. So yes, I can take funerals there. Arnos Vale, I do a lot of natural burial at Arnos Vale, and of course we work really hand in hand together there. So it would be the relationship between the family, Arnos Vale, and either the celebrant or the vicar or whatever, if you have one, and myself will support a family to create a burial or a ceremony at Arnos Vale.
And I have to say they were very good.
Mm.
And they even allowed us to set aside their catering of conventional sandwiches in favour of a Quaker provided bring and share meal.
Nice. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? You know, it's not to say that all funeral directors are shocking, because they're obviously not. But I think the problem is that, as I've said a couple of times, we arrive at these moments often quite emotionally compromised, don't we? And so it's just knowing that we can ask those questions. So for you, that was really important. They were able to facilitate that for you. So I think it's always about just checking that your funeral director can be flexible enough to do what is important to you, and for the person who's died.
And any more questions, anyone?
I see Barney's hand up.
Barney?
Yes, it's a surprise to me, even though I live nearby, to know that Arnos Vale is open for woodland burials again. I don't suppose it's been for very long. And our friend Graham Davey was buried there a few weeks ago. Were you by any chance, did you assist in that, or was that, yes. Oh,
Yes.
Anyway, the family were very happy with that, and indeed they were very happy with the memorial meeting we had separately at the meeting house 2 days later.
I think that worked really well for Graham's family, and I was really touched actually that they asked me to lead that short burial service for Graham. And again, that was a very classic example of what was right for Graham and what was right for their family. And that ability to have something that's very private and personal for the family, while at the same time planning something that was much larger for those others who knew Graham. And of course, he was well known by many people. But yes, I think I've been doing the burials there for about, well, certainly since I've been open here. So certainly for 4 years. And it's a really, I mean, what I'm always amazed at is hearing woodpeckers in the center of a city is always quite astonishing. I love that it's not a destination cemetery. You know, it's a place where people go for all sorts of reasons, not just because they've died and not just because someone they know has died. So I've been to some great talks there about the, people of Bristol and the cinema club. So I think it's run almost like a very traditional Victorian cemetery. And of course, the Victorians were all about using the cemetery. They used to take massive picnics and sitting around their loved ones' graves, involving their ancestors. And I think that sense of really remaining connected to our roots is a really important one. And we kind of forgotten that, really. So it's lovely to see that places like Arnos Vale are able to do that and continue to provide that service.
Yes, you mentioned lots of people knew Graham. We had 80 people in the meeting house, the biggest meeting we've ever had there for 10 years, and about 40 people online. It was quite amazing.
How wonderful, how wonderful. And I'm pleased that it went so well for the family.
Graham was a very active member of the discussion group. And he's given us a wonderful talk less than a week before he died.
I know, and I mean, I was amazed to hear he was still cycling, the night before. I mean, he was quite a force, wasn't he?
Yes. Thank you very much indeed, Dee. I've made a note of everyone who's here, so I hope I will be able to include everyone and send out anything that you'd like me to send out. But if I make a mistake and I slip up, please don't fear to contact me and say, "Oh, you forgot me. I wanted that stuff from Dee Ryding." Okay, thank you. All right. Thank you very much, Dee.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent.
And thank you all for bearing with me on quite a difficult topic. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
David, do I just end or what do I do?
You tell us what the talk is next week.
Oh dear. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh dear. So I was quite stressed out by the way we started. I temporarily completely forgotten what it is. Just a second, I've got it here. Hold on. Oh, we've got Barney Smith, who was with us just now. It's called When I Was Tried and Found Guilty by My Area Meeting. Which sounds a bit terrifying, actually. But I don't know who's left, and I do apologise. Thank you, Brian. Looking forward to it.
Okay. You end the meeting or I end the meeting.
Okay.
Any way we end it.
We'll do it somehow, but don't worry.